Other people have talked about many things, so yes, I will talk about whatever comes to my head. So I don't go to many conferences, and those of you who are in consulting will probably understand why. We make money when people are on projects, so conferences are a bit of a, profitability detractor. But I'm really enjoying this one actually because there's so many different perspectives, and we've got our established players, we've got our new entrants, we've got our agitators, revolutionaries. It's really fascinating, and it's a sign of an industry which could well be facing revolution, right? Or at least fundamental change. And it takes me back a bit to the telecoms industry, where before the advent of voice over IP, before the European Union got involved in reducing roaming tariffs to give consumers better value. And I remember at the time I was working for BT. BT had billions of pounds of revenue coming in from international direct dial. And your telephone calls to foreign countries were just remarkably expensive. They knew that voice over IP and indirect mechanisms for making international calls were coming. They knew that. They could sense it. But what did they do about it? Well, they did a few things, but many of those things were too late. And why were many of those things too late? Well, I guess it was the threat, or the perceived threat, of cannibalization, allowing other people to take revenues which you see as rightfully yours. And perhaps that's where we are with some elements of the banking industry. Where do I point this thing? Ah, there. But I think what many of the banks have got is a question about how they get value from the market, and how do they create value for their customers, because the two things are linked. And APIs have been evident in retail and on e-commerce and many other areas for a long time. And yet here we are talking about them as if they're radically new in finance. And of course they are, because the banks have not, by and large, opened up at any scale APIs to other entities that want to use their services. So there is a value choice for the banks here. And the value that they might find is in the realization that if they get greater connectivity, if they give greater connectivity to their customers, perhaps they stay at the heart of what the customer actually wants, whatever that may be. And some of the discussion with Sheila over just in the break, and it kind of dawned on me that perhaps one of the ways in which the banks can create that value and not be knocked off their top spot by Mondo is by having customers come to them and get other people's services from them. So no longer do you go through the conventional model that many of us have of, I get my ISA over here, my savings account over here, my current account over here. Perhaps you can go to your favored bank, which manages your identity services, and get those financial services products coming in from numerous other places. And if anything, perhaps that is their rescue model, right? The ability to set themselves up as a preferred consumer destination. But it's going to require a lot of thought, and it's going to require, I think, a lot of radicalism from commercial entities that are not necessarily famous for being radical. I mean, radicalism and banking do not go hand in hand, because they're going to have to reimagine their processes and their boundaries. And that fundamental question about what you are selling to whom, which is the heart of all commerce, I'd suggest. And they're going to have to build completely new businesses, because the conventional retail banking model isn't going to go away overnight, but alongside it is going to have to coexist, perhaps to replace it later, a model of an API-based business that makes its money by openness rather than closedness. So that's the reimagination bit. And then to do this at any scale, you face a lot of architectural choices. Are you choosing Akana, Apigee, any of the other vendors that are with us, and a host more, because this is quite a crowded space from a technology perspective. So you're going to have to make those choices. You're going to have to find new platforms, new standards, And then you're going to have to run, scale, and iterate. And iterate because you know you're not going to get it right first time. So there's a huge amount for banks to do. So what are the signs that they are in any way doing it? Well, some of them are. I mean, we are involved in scale API programs with half a dozen European banks right now. So some of them are thinking about this and doing stuff about it as we speak. So what are the things that we see working? Well, as I say, this is big. It is complex for the banks, and it is radically different to their current modes of operation. So the rest of my discussion is going to focus on the sort of things that we see as working and necessary if the banks are going to get themselves to a better position around APIs. And it starts, I think, with governance, because as Stevie mentioned, that they've got all this stuff around governance and compliance there for a reason, right? It may not be desperately useful for the sort of more revolutionary elements within the bank that want to go and create these things, but they're very nervous about what they release. They have to accommodate multiple stakeholders, and they need a systematic model of governance in order to have any prospect of doing that. So that's a bit about governance. We'll come back to that in a moment. Certainly customer testing is going to feature quite strongly, and working out which customers to test it from. There seems to be a belief that you can choose your customers for your APIs. Now, I think that's going to break down fairly quickly, because if the regulator sees any banks favouring customer set A over customer set B, they're going to have something to say about it. So opening up APIs is a bit of a floodgate, because they're not going to be able to choose to serve or favour particular areas. In fact, it may get very interesting if this distinction that we heard from Aaron around internal APIs and external APIs starts to break down. Again, flip back to the telecoms industry. What's happened there? Well, BT has OpenReach, right? So I could phone up mainstream BT Retail, ask for a telephone line. BT Retail asks OpenReach to go provision that line through the same API in inverted commas, the same order mechanism if I had phoned up any other provider of telephony services. So there's these arm's length API-enabled mechanisms within the telecoms industry. Perhaps they'll come into the banking industry as well. So some of these programs that are starting in a number of European banks have some interesting characteristics. So let's explore a bit more what is working for them. First bit is, as I mentioned, governance. It's necessary to have some form of framework around how you're going to do this, because you've got your multiple stakeholders. You've got the businesses themselves, and bear in mind there are several businesses within any conventional bank. You've got your own digital office, perhaps setting out a framework for doing this. It's going to have its say. You've got your ecosystem partners. You've got your tech partners. A lot of things have to be brought together into some form of a framework before you can do this in a systematic and scaled fashion. Your governance mechanisms may also not be quite fit for purpose, because they're geared to conventional product sets which are changing perhaps slower than the APIs that you're going to need to be putting out. So a lot of attention, we suggest, needs to go into governance framework, how you conduct and run these programs. And that's not just for fun, it's just a necessity in order to operate within a complex organization. And then the next question, which I've already touched on already, is this question around strategy and prioritization. A bank has many lines of business. It's got personal, corporate, loans, mortgages, payments. If this stuff starts to work, they're all going to want a slice. And you've got limited technical capability to go engineer, control, market this stuff. You've also got your strategy being defined by its interaction with your potential market. And we've talked this afternoon about hackathons being a form of market test. And I agree with the speaker who mentioned that that's probably not the only form of market test, or necessarily the definitive market test, because you're really only getting partial exposure to the market that you're aiming for. So you need that strategy to guide you in what could well be a bit of a tsunami of demand within the bank, right? And we would suggest you have to have some form of prioritization framework, because some of these banks are already dealing with hundreds of API cases, right? And which of those hundreds do you prioritize? Which form coherent sets that your customers might wish to use? And then the third component, I think, woohoo, that's the fourth. Third component is to have some form of standardization and scalable production processes. Now, this sounds rather dull, boring in consulting, but bear in mind that banks have to handle millions, if not billions, of transactions every year. And you get a sense of the scale that they're going to have to build to. And architecting that in a consistent fashion so that developers are not exposed to a whole different series of software structures is going to be a challenge. And then we often get the question about, well, this doesn't sound very agile. And agile is the mode that the IT industry seems to have adopted. And there's a reason for that. Agile has its place, and we think that agile has its place kind of within elements of the program, but having some degree of overriding architecture is necessary, and that's perhaps less agile than we've started to experience within UX-oriented stuff. There's the architecture side, there's a UX side to this as well. The UX side is far more amenable to agile than perhaps the architecture is. Some of these choices could be relatively long-term. And then we've got mechanisms for scaling this, because some of these programs should be involving hundreds of people across a combination of technology partners, consulting partners like ourselves, and the bank's own people as well. These are going to be big programs as this takes off. And then the engagement and the market testing. This is an area which I think there's a tendency for people to ignore. The one-off hackathon seems fine, but there's the necessity to keep doing this over and over again as you launch new sets of APIs, providing sandboxed APIs for developers to test against. It's not just the developers, it's actually the businesses that you're seeking to interact with that require some form of market testing ongoing. So that's some of the things that we see working, I suppose, as these projects get moving. But then when we get into production, there's a new set, there's a fifth set of things that we think have to be done well. And here, you're very much in the operation, the IT operation of large-scale systems. So you're going to have methods around your go live, you switch from into production, maintenance, upgrades, incident management. You've got a whole service suite around this that has to be put in place in order for this to work smoothly. Because, again, go back to this idea about regulation getting a handle into this. It's not going to be acceptable for banks to offer a worse standard of service externally to internally. That's the way the regulation, we suspect, will head. Therefore, your IT ops is going to have to be right up, but it is starting to happen, perhaps as a response to the agitators and disruptors that we've heard from this afternoon. So thank you very much. I see it really in terms of consistency. Sorry. Right. Again, governance in that interaction of what is going to be expected from this combination of opportunity, threat, and regulator. So how precise, is your question about how it will affect the actual software structures?
Yeah, and also Also, if your clients are asking about how to make their APIs more consistent, how to scale that consistency across the entire, because you can have consistency in a small team,
yes,
but when you scale across the world, how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the big challenges, because what we're seeing is a tendency for particular product lines to say, look, we've got a set of APIs which would start to publish, and those would be radically different from the structure of any other product line. Now, it may well be that the external entities are looking for a bank-wide consistency, maybe even an industry-wide consistency around how APIs are structured.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Thank you. Tom.
Thanks. I have a question about the total cost and timescale involved. Take an example of one of the big 5 UK banks, starting from scratch, no API, all the way to launching a public REST API. What would you estimate is the rough total cost and timeline for getting that done? For just one? Yeah, just one bank.
No, one bank or one API?
So take a basic set of customer functionalities. So I can see my balance, I can download my transactions, I can make a payment as a single customer plus third-party access.
I would put that somewhere between 3 to 6 months to get that out in a consistent form in the way that you've just set the question, right? The problem then comes around scale and where it goes next. Because if that takes off, and some of these get balance type APIs I think could be immensely popular very, very quickly, they then have this legacy architecture issue. And if you see the tsunami of calls on legacy architecture coming from the outside, that could be potentially very bad news, right? Particularly if my theory about regulation comes true, and if you throttle your external API, you've also got to be throttling your internal. So it's almost a how long is a piece of string type question, because getting the initial API out there in, let's call it, a fragile form is relatively straightforward. Getting it out there in a robust and scalable fashion is far less so. And I think these API programs are going to run for several years for each bank.
Great. Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, thanks for that. I was wondering, with the banks I've been speaking to, they're often starting at that second point. So the innovation leads are given responsibility to get on with the API strategy. They're working with a little bit of cross-departmental around setting priorities. But then and I think this might be relevant for some of the people in the room as far as something they need to go back and practice, how do they then go about trying to encourage a governance framework on top of, like if they've got to sort of manage up to get that in place?
Yeah, I understand your issue. It is kind of ground-driven, isn't it? You've got a department which is going to the hackathons. It's the open innovation type department. And what we're starting to see is that is getting top-down attention, right? This realization that this is such a big issue that you're going to have to do it across the bank. It's not just going to be your mortgages product line, to pick one at random. It's going to have to be across the bank. What I think we're yet to see is the C-level conviction that they want to see this in place within a defined time frame across whole banks. But that's starting to tip.
Okay, so
he's going to ask me a question in C++. I can feel it coming.
I hate C++. I'm not going to ask you a question in that. Just to follow up Tom's question, he asked how much, and my question is, like, indicatively, do you know how much banks are allocating towards API strategies / PSD2 access to account compliance? Like what sort of level of money do they have earmarked for that?
I know the size of the projects that we are encountering, but I'm not going to disclose that. I will say that I think they are seriously under budgeting.
That's what I think as well.
Because of time concerns, or?
Because of resource priorities. I mean, you think about what it's like to be a bank at the moment. You've got your remediation going on. You've got you've got low interest rates, you've got core banking systems. The calls on capital are just so numerous, right? This is one of them. And I do think it's a question of prioritization, but as Stevie and I agree, I think they are hugely under budgeting for this sort of work.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mike. Thank you.